Hello everyone and welcome to PH2222 Philosophy of Language. This is Lecture 1, Why I Like the Philosophy of Language. So my name is Neil Barton. I'll be taking the course this semester, and often it's kind of customary to give a little bit of a lecture about why the subject in question is important. That's a very difficult question to answer, so I'm going to settle for just telling you why I like it. Okay, so it's good when you start anything to ask, why on earth am I doing this, okay? Especially, I'm a philosopher, I'm in a philosophy department, so I should be able to give you some motivating reasons as why you want to take the course. So here's my main aim for this sort of short first little lecture, give you some motivating reasons to take the course and find it interesting. So I'll start out with some sort of very general problems about the philosophy of language. We'll go into some more specific issues that will come up throughout the course. And then we'll kind of move into some little philosophical tasters. So we'll first talk about some helpful distinctions that will be useful in the course. And then I'll set up a little puzzle that we'll start to talk about next time. Great. So you can't know whether something's worth doing without knowing roughly what it is. So here's our first opening question. What is the philosophy of language? Okay, what is this thing we're doing called philosophy of language? And here's a sort of slightly silly and facetious characterization. Well, philosophy of language just simply concerns the philosophical questions about language. Okay, not the most enlightening characterization, right? However, it does let you get started on thinking about what questions are specific to the philosophy of language and what are general philosophical considerations about language. Okay, so here's one point. Many of the questions that pop up in other areas of philosophy, perhaps you've already done a philosophy course, will appear here too. So, what is a language, right? What is a language made up of? We might say, what's the ontology of a language, if you've heard that term before? Are there ethical considerations surrounding language use? How do we know things about language? These kinds of questions sort of pop up in any kind of discipline. So, for instance, if I was doing philosophy of physics, I could basically replace the term language with physics here and get interesting questions also, right? So if you've done a philosophy course before, you may be aware of these kinds of questions and the fact that they can be asked about almost any area. So as I just said, you could replace language with physics in all those examples and you get a very similar phenomenon. But philosophy of language does come with some of its own more specific questions. Okay, so there are things that you might ask about language that wouldn't make necessarily so much sense to ask in every other area of philosophy. And in fact, you get some interesting links with other areas of philosophy by looking at these specific questions, things like cognitive science, linguistics, philosophy of logic. So here's some examples. Is language specific to humans? Or do animals have languages or proto-languages too, or something like that? Is every sentence of language either true or false, or is indeterminacy possible? And how do we understand each other when we use language? So you might think these are questions that are more specific to the study of language. When we look at questions like these, we see links to other areas. So for instance, this kind of question, right? Is language specific to humans, or do animals have languages too? This is something you might think something like cognitive science has a big bearing on. When we think about indeterminacy, okay, you do get indeterminacy in other areas of philosophy, very relevant in philosophy of language in particular. That then has links to things like philosophy of logic, right? How do you handle that indeterminacy if you're countenancing that not everything is true or false? Things like classical logic might go away if you know what classical logic is. Again, things about understanding, right? How language is structured, close links to things like linguistics, right? How do we construct a language? What are the structure of particular linguistic claims, and how are we able to understand that as hearers of a particular language? Okay, cool. I think there's also something to point out here that language seems special or mysterious or puzzling in various ways. So I just want to kind of reflect on what's happening right now. So right now, I am making noises and I'm pointing with my mouse at particular stuff, right? And I'm using various words, and you see my jabbing, albeit it's recorded. So future people are seeing my jabbing at things with my mouse, hearing these noises, seeing the words on the page, and then you're able to kind of reconstruct. It's unclear how perfectly one can do it, but you're able to reconstruct propositional content that resembles perhaps the propositional content that I have in my mind right now. So there's some kind of very strange compression and decompression of information going on where I'm taking thoughts and I'm putting them into this codified artifacts, words, sounds, right? And then you're able to extract the information from that, right? And this is kind of impressive when you think about it. This is not clear at all, sitting from the armchair that this kind of thing should be possible. Yet humans do it very, very naturally. We're very, very good at this. So when one really reflects on this raises a whole host of questions. Okay, so words and sentences, sounds, written symbols can be about things in the world. Okay, how does this happen in the physical world? So if I say, here's my slightly old these days sports watch. When I say my watch is grey, this is not just a bunch of noises, or if I wrote it down, written symbols. This is about this particular watch I have here, right? How does this linking of language to the watch happen? The sort of spooky action at distance cases. So a sentence can be true here because of events there. So, for instance, if you think about monarchies, when a monarch dies, the next in succession instantly becomes the new monarch, right? So it seems like, let's suppose that somebody is traveling, one of the first in line is traveling very far on the other side of the world from the actual monarch. The monarch dies, instantly the sentence, this person on the other side of the world is the monarch, becomes true, right? But this isn't normally how we think of, things making other things true. If you think of it in a physical context, the billiard ball moved. That's usually because of something very immediate to the billiard ball, right? Maybe another billiard ball hits it. It seems like language is distinctive to humans versus non-human animals, in question mark. Maybe even what makes humans special. Certainly, we don't know of any other animals that have the kind of complexity of language that we possess. And moreover, it seems like an infinity of possible propositions can be expressed in language. Okay, so take this example. Yesterday, I was violently tickled by a hippopotamus wearing a fedora in the upper floor of the deck. Okay, so you can understand what that means, right? But presumably, none of you had considered that sentence before just now. So what that indicates is this kind of compositionality to language. If I pack together words in exactly the right way, I get new propositions that haven't been considered. And it seems that there's just an infinity of these things. How are mere finite beings like us able to have access, in some sense, to an infinity of possible propositions in that way? Finally, we sometimes often communicate things that go far beyond the literal meaning of what we say. So often you might think, well, perhaps there's some way we could just, from the mere presentation of the words, right, extract the meaning or what is intended from the presentation of those words. This seems really difficult, right? So in the context of writing a reference letter, if I write, John has excellent handwriting and is very punctual, right? That kind of communicates that, John is not a very good student, right? If I really wanted to write a reference letter extolling John's virtues, I would say something like, John is fantastically creative or something along those lines, right? Focusing on the handwriting and the punctuality is actually not positive in this context. Other things are things like metaphors, right? So Andy has a monkey on their back. In that context, Andy does not literally have a monkey on their back, an actual ape moving around on their back. It's meant to communicate something about, let's say, Andy's mental states. Okay, good. And I want to just present an issue that I'm especially fond of here that will come up later in the course. It's kind of a puzzle that I think runs in the background of a lot of philosophy of language. And that's that language is central to philosophy because a huge amount of philosophy takes place in the medium of language, right? So if I want to disagree with you, I've got to have some kind of shared framework of concepts in which to express this disagreement, shared framework language. So when we're arguing about philosophy of language, not only are we arguing about language, but we're arguing in language. So it can make disagreements very intractable sometimes, and working within a language, right? And it might be that people just talk past each other because of linguistic differences, things like that, or conceptual differences. So this is a very subtle issue. Don't worry if it doesn't immediately, it's not immediately totally clear to you. This kind of meta issue is going to pop up repeatedly throughout the course, but especially towards the end when we start to talk about changes in concepts and something called conceptual engineering. Okay, so language seems very mysterious and puzzling, and there's this sort of background issue that I'm quite fond of that we'll talk a bit about throughout the course. But there's also respects in which language can seem quite mundane, right? So language at least seems continuous with other forms of intelligent collaboration, right? Signaling, games, hunting, complex behavior, and these are often observed in the non-human animal world as well. So think of like a wolf pack hunting together. This sign kind of seems like some sort of collaboration, just, in a similar way, language seems like some sort of kind of collaboration, right, in order to achieve an end. So it doesn't seem totally mysterious, We do seem to be able to have more mundane kinds of collaboration that are perhaps better understood than language in all its complexity. We can also make sense of kind of sort of more primitive natural meanings. So, for instance, if you see smoke, that in some sense means fire, right? Or tells you about the existence of fire. Smoke is a proxy for the existence of fire. A bit like language can be proxy for things like objects or proposition or content. Spots means measles, right? We understand how to link proxies with other kinds of phenomenon. And whilst we can say, in principle, infinitely many things, we only have finitely many atomic words or particles by which we do this, right? Our lexicon, in some sense, is not a basic lexicon. It's not infinite. It's to do with compositionality that we can say infinitely many things. It's only by bolting those things together that we get to say infinitely many things. And moreover, sadly, we only have finitely much time in which to do this, right? So whilst in principle we could say infinitely many things, in practicality, sadly, we're only ever going to say finitely many things. So we'll be looking at a lot of the formal puzzles that I gave on the previous slide, but one thing you might think is perhaps these latter mundane facts or reflecting on these more mundane facts can help solve them. Okay, good. So these are kinds of some issues to do with philosophy of language, why you might find it puzzling, why you might find it interesting and want to know more about it. let's just give some distinctions that will be helpful throughout the course. We'll get some distinctions on the table, and then I'll present a puzzle for you to think about for next time. So first, syntax. Syntax concerns the arrangements of words and symbols, okay? Which strings of symbols form grammatical sentences of English. So, I am hungry is a grammatical sentence of English. Potato, keys, water bottle, give high five is not a grammatical sentence of English. Then there's facts about the meanings of words, right? So we have the arrangements and what's to count as good pieces of language, that's our syntax, but then how those bits of language correspond onto the world, for instance, is what's called semantics, okay? So the fact that dog is a meaningful word of English and one that refers to, in particular, dogs, right? So you have the particular word dog, and it refers to these sort of four-legged furry creatures who are real fun, right? There's also something that will come up towards the end of the course. This is a little more into the advanced topics in philosophy of language. This is meta-semantics. So semantics concerns the meanings of specific words, right? What specific words refer to or mean. And meta-semantics are theories about how our words get their meaning. So you can have different theories about how the semantics are fixed. And that's what meta-semantics is about. And we'll look at that a bit more towards the end of the course. Finally, pragmatics. This concerns facts about what is communicated over and above the literal meaning of the words. So our handwriting sentence from the last slide, talking about John's handwriting in a reference letter, might mean that, John is really a bad student, right? The fact that I focus on their handwriting in the reference letter is to communicate that John is a bad student without having to be so blunt as to say that John is a bad student. And examples of metaphor and things like that are other examples where we go over and above the literal meaning of the words, and this relates to these ideas of pragmatics. Okay, good. So in this course, we're going to be talking a lot about both words and what words refer to or are about. Okay, so that was, this suite of issues that we just discussed on the previous slide is linking words to meaning or, in some sense, content. Okay, so the way philosophers usually handle this when we want to be careful, right, is via the use of what's called the use-mention distinction, and this is marked with quotation marks. So this is the difference, for instance, between what a word refers to and the word itself. Okay, so here's we'll use Taylor Swift. Taylor Swift, possibly unbeknownst to her, has become kind of a canonical example in philosophy these days, and we'll continue to use her. So Taylor Swift is a famous American singer, but Taylor Swift, in quotation marks, is a name that refers to Taylor Swift, right? So Taylor Swift without quotation marks, right? This is not a piece of language. Taylor Swift with quotation marks, that's referring to the piece of language, okay? Taylor Swift without quotation marks is from Nashville. Taylor Swift with quotation marks contains 11 letters, including a capital S, right? Taylor Swift without quotation marks doesn't contain any letters. She's a person. And this iterates, okay? So if we do double quotation marks, right? So we have quotation marks, quotation Taylor Swift. Let me just put some red there so you can see it a bit better, right? That is the name for the name of Taylor Swift. So this iterates. And if I were to put a third, right, quotation mark here, that would be the name for the name for the name of Taylor Swift. Okay, so we can iterate this. Okay, so just to wrap up, Taylor Swift, in quotation marks, isn't from Nashville, nor can it sing. it being a word, right, or a name and not an actual person. And on the other hand, Taylor Swift, without quotation marks, the person, can't be misspelled. This is a person, not a name. But her name can be misspelled. Okay. Okay, so I hope that's clear. This will pop up a lot, and if it's still a little unclear, this will become clear as we go through the course. Okay, a few extra distinctions, keeping in mind different parts of language. So that use-mention distinction is very useful when we want to keep the distinction between kind of the world and bits of language in mind. But also language has different forms, okay? So you have singular terms, right? These are names, and we have the predicates that apply to them, okay? So Aristotle is a philosopher. Aristotle, in quotation marks, for instance, is a name, and is a philosopher, right, is a predicate. Right? It's a piece of language that applies to name, right? Other examples, it doesn't have to be a specific name always. The man in the door is wearing a hat, right? And also you can have predicates aren't always just one place. You can have multiple place predicates. So Ash loves Charizard, right? It's a two-place predicate, right? Something loves something else, right? But Charizard doesn't love Ash, sadly. Okay. Plural terms and plural predicates. Okay, we have singular terms. These denote kind of objects, right? And we have predicates that apply to those. And then we have plural terms and plural predicates. So Russell and Whitehead wrote Principia Mathematica. Russell and Whitehead is a term that refers to both Russell and Whitehead, right, together, right? Not just one or the other of them. And writing Principia Mathematica is something they did together, right? It's not the case that individually Russell on his own wrote Principia Mathematica. They did it together. Other examples, the soldiers surround the castle. Okay, the soldiers here is a plural term that refers to many things in the plural, and surrounding the castle is something they do together, not any one of them individually. And so, in addition to these singular terms, we can also have plural terms and plural predicates. We then have quantifiers that let us express a kind of generality, okay? So every person deserves respect, right? This is something that's not this every person, right? It's natural to think that this isn't a name. This is something that is quantifying over all the people, right? And to go along with the universal quantifier, you also have what's called the existential quantifier. Some people don't deserve respect, right? Or deserve my respect, right? That would be using the quantifier that's satisfied just in case there's at least one person who doesn't deserve my respect. Okay? And as you can see, these quantifiers are still being combined with predicates to yield propositional content. Just one bonus one. I do a bit of philosophy of mathematics. Here's one that pops up a lot in my field. Every mathematical object is contained in one universe. And if you want to talk to me about that more generally, there's some interesting examples that I like where philosophy of language and philosophy of mathematics really bash up against one another. But this is too early for that, so let me not introduce that just now. Okay, very good. So what have we had? So we've had some reasons why philosophy of language is interesting. We've had some more specific issues. We've put some distinctions on the table. Here's a puzzle that we'll start talking about soon. Okay? Famous puzzle. What does a name like Bob Dylan mean? Right? There's a very simple and natural answer to this question. Bob Dylan, the name, means Bob Dylan, the person, the famous American musician. That is just the meaning of the name, is exactly, the person with the very good ability to write lyrics, but also a slightly unusual voice. Okay, call this the referential view of meaning, right? Let's just take names to begin with. It gets complicated for the other categories of words. let's just focus just on names for the time being. Now, fact, Bob Dylan is just the very same person as Robert Zimmerman, right? So Bob Dylan means, if we have, let's think about how this is all happening, right? So we have this person, right? As you can see, my mouse drawing is wonderful, right? Playing a guitar, perhaps. Okay. This is Bob Dylan, right? Just do BD and we'll put it in quotation marks to indicate we're talking about a name, right? And this means, according to this view, or this guy. And then we've got the name Robert Zimmerman, right? Which means that very same guy, according to this view. So you have the piece of language and the meaning is just the same person in each case, rocking out on stage. Okay. So think about this. Bob Dylan, right? Remember, let me put my picture back up. We've got Bob Dylan and we've got the two names, right? Has exactly the same meaning. It expresses exactly the same proposition as Robert Zimmerman is a famous musician, right? Because presumably is a famous musician isn't changing meaning between these two cases. But think about the state you might be in. So I knew who Bob Dylan was quite early in my life. I guess I was sort of, early preteen, but I didn't know that Bob Dylan also bore the name Robert Zimmerman, right? So there was a period of time in my life when I believed that Bob Dylan is a famous musician, but I didn't believe that Robert Zimmerman is a famous musician. Never heard of Robert Zimmerman, right? So here's the thought to be picked up next time. What might the problem be here? If we think that names, right, their meaning is just the things they denote, what is the issue with being in a context in which I believe that Bob Dylan is a famous musician, but I don't believe that Robert Zimmerman is a famous musician? Okay, I'll leave you with that little puzzle for next time. We'll talk about this a bunch. Thanks for listening, and I look forward to meeting everybody next week.